Thank you for joining us on EarthFile. I am Ayola Kasim. 2015 is a year of opportunities to combat climate change and transform economies. That was the message from the World Bank President, Jim Yong Kim. Climate change and how to fight it dominated the talks at the just concluded World Economic Forum, a meeting of top world business leaders in Davos, Switzerland. With the falling oil prices and the damaging effects climate change is having on world economies, we have been told that we now have a series of opportunities in play that give us potential for breakthroughs. All this and more on EarthFile. Do stay with us. Over 2,500 business and political leaders, including more than 40 heads of state and government, met in the Swiss resort of Davos, Switzerland for the 45th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in January, where they debated the main political and economic issues of the day, including international terrorism, world poverty, economic growth, and climate change.
The climate summit I hosted in September last year has created new political momentum. I'm very encouraged that the European Union has taken far-reaching visionary leadership decision to cut 40% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and China and the United States have agreed a very significant reduction of greenhouse gas emissions.
We have to change something called the poverty elasticity of growth. There's no growth estimate that we can see that will get us to below 3% extreme poverty by 2030. So we have to find a way to ensure that growth is robust, but has an even larger impact on the poor than it has had over the last 20 years, or we'll never get to the goal of ending poverty.
We are the first generation that can end poverty, and the last generation that can take steps to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Future generations will judge us harshly if we fail to do upholding our moral and historical responsibilities.
The French president called on the world's biggest businesses to play their part in countering global warming in his speech at Davos. He urged world leaders to take bold action to prevent temperature increases and lower greenhouse gas emissions.
Ici, à Davos, en parlant d'économie,
Mr. Hollande is due to host a climate conference in Paris in December. Amid fears the summit will fail if world leaders decide to put cutting carbon emissions ahead of economic growth.
La conférence sur le climat de Paris, il doit y avoir un accord global.
At the climate conference in Paris, we need to reach a binding global agreement that will map out an effective fight against global warming. That's the major challenge of the 21st century. The time has passed when humankind thought it could selfishly, senselessly draw on resources that were considered inexhaustible. We know now the Earth is not a commodity, not a source of revenue. It's a heritage that we share. The consequences of global warming are now fully known. There are no longer hypotheses, there are certainties.
Les conséquences du réchauffement sont désormais entièrement connues. Ce ne sont plus des hypothèses, ce sont des certitudes.
Green energy was the way forward, he said.
Des capitaux doivent s'investir massivement.
We need huge investment in the green economy. Today, if you look at the traditional investment portfolios, less than 1% is invested in the green economy. We therefore need to create a new market, a market of financial products, a market of bonds, of green bonds that would operate at a global level.
D'obligations vertes à l'échelle du monde.
The Paris summit in December will face a tougher task to agree a United Nations deal to slow climate change after the hopes of many that cooperation between Washington and Beijing would be a magic key to end global gridlock dissolved in a chaotic preparatory talks in Lima last year.
Every country, in our view, should have a statutory climate change act, which you put in like we've done in Britain, You impose and govern it by domestic legislation. Now, that is, I think, is the way forward. And I think I'm strengthening that view by what the Americans and the Chinese are doing. Clearly, it's a new kind of G2, you know, where China and America have got together to agree to cut the carbon. What the rate of that is another matter, but at the moment they're agreeing that. But the important point is, as Obama has said, he cannot get Congress to agree a kind of overseas, what they call another global agreement. So he's now come out and said, I'll use my presidential powers, which we've argued for a time that he should use. But that is not the global agreement. It's not a globally enforceable agreement that has to go to the Congress. So he's doing it by presidential power, which is domestic legislation. China already was imposing domestic legislation and its own commitments in its white paper. Europe has took a different line, and that's what I was trying to point out today. The European leaders still seem to be of the mind that you have to have the Kyoto Global Framework, which means, presumably, the legal framework. Well, that is what the Kyoto 1 was, but it won't be what I call the Paris Protocol. And Europe has to change. And I think the chance for Europe, and this is for 2015, is to recognize that both China and America have come to an agreement which was within the domestic legal framework. Europe could do the same. Britain already has done that. And there lies the answer to get Europe to recognize that if it plays the negotiating role with the Americans and China, we can get another agreement, the Paris one admittedly, to follow on from Kyoto 1.
At best, Paris may be a chance to reform a sprawling system of annual United Nations talks. More than 11,000 delegates attended the 2-week talks in the 10th city in Lima and find ways to boost long-term action to stem rising greenhouse gas emissions. In Lima, about 190 governments agreed only to some modest building blocks of a Paris Accord, despite high expectations for a positive outcome after China and the United States, the world's top 2 emitters, agreed jointly to limit emissions. The UN Secretary General is now urging world leaders to take action to save the world from multiple crises.
2015 is a year for global action. We are faced with the multiple crises in this world: geopolitical, socio-economic, and sustainable development. The year ahead must be a time for our strong commitment and for a global action. With the adoption of the post-2015 development agenda, with a set of sustainable development goals and an agreement, universal and meaningful climate change agreement by December this year in Paris, I think we can set our life, our world on course for a better future.
The United Nations has asked governments to submit plans to cut greenhouse gas emissions as the building blocks of the deal due in Paris in December to limit global warming. Governments have agreed an informal deadline of the 31st of March to submit plans as the basis of the United Nations deal to slow climate change, which nearly all climate scientists say is mainly due to rising emissions of man-made greenhouse gases.
Well, that's true, but
The head of the United Nations Climate Secretariat said the meeting in Paris was a chance to get on track towards a deep decarbonization of the global economy, achieving climate neutrality in the second half of the century.
it will take several iterations or several generations, if you will, several harvests of efforts of countries every time with increasing ambition, such that every time the gap between what science says where we should be and where we are, that gap will get smaller and smaller until we reach the ultimate objective of decarbonization, which is climate neutrality in the second half of the century. But we're not going to get there with the Paris Agreement, with the numbers that will be there next year. We will get there over time.
The Secretariat launched a website to collect the national plans, Climate neutrality means net zero emissions, or that any emissions from burning fossil fuels are offset by measures such as planting trees that soak up carbon dioxide as they grow.
Forest degradation, for example, all over the world, it's an issue that requires complementary legislation in different countries. It also has a trade-off effect on climate change policies as well, or climate change laws as well, because these trees that we cut down, they serve as carbon sinks, and then as long as we continue to engage in intensive deforestation, we are losing our natural capital. And then we also believe that because there is no value attached to the kind of ecosystem, I call them ecosystem services. There are certain services we derive from the environment, but in Nigeria and so many other countries, even in some developed countries, they don't have a value attached to it. So there's this new concept called the economics of ecosystems, which means they are now beginning to look at the environment as an economic entity, which means laws of economic laws will now also be applied to dealing with conserving the environment.
This year, representatives of about 200 governments will meet in Paris to try to forge a deal to limit global warming to avoid floods, drought, heat waves, and rising sea levels blamed on increasing emissions of greenhouse gases, which result from burning fossil fuels such as coal and oil. A year ago in Davos, World Bank Group President Jim Kim encouraged investors at the World Economic Forum to take a closer look at green bonds, a relatively new but growing option for investing in a sustainable and responsible way. Green bonds act like other bonds, but they can help fill gaps in much-needed development finance for climate-friendly projects. About $11 billion in green bonds had been issued the previous year. The president called for doubling the annual issuances by the September 2014 Climate Leadership Summit. With new types of issuers, new green bond indices being created, and more buyers investing, the year closed with more than $35 billion in new green bonds. The world's fast-growing cities and developing countries face an increasing financial challenge from climate change. They need roads, airports, buildings, water systems, and energy supplies that can stand up to rising global temperatures and extreme weather patterns. Farms and food supply chains are also at risk without new investment. While it's clear in many cases what needs to be done, finding the funding for it is often challenging, especially for governments with already pinched budgets.
We're looking to increase the mix within that energy system in any country. And in fact, our own lending has shifted radically over the last 5 years away from fossil fuel energy towards renewable energy. But for some countries, the options remain ones where fossil fuels will continue to be part of that energy mix. So you want to make sure that if fossil fuels are part of the energy mix, that they're used in the most efficient way possible, and then you want to shift the mix towards renewables. So some countries have a natural endowment which makes that easy, some countries don't, and it makes it less easy. Now, I think what's interesting is that in the oil and natural gas industry, we have a significant involvement in trying to end gas flaring. So this is where you're drilling for oil and you burn the associated gas. We have, over the last 10 years, helped countries and companies reduce significantly gas flaring, and we're now looking at a commitment from the oil industry and from countries who are oil producers for a 2030 commitment to end all gas flaring. And we're working with companies, nationally owned companies and independent oil companies and countries to do that.